back. 4 separate pieces of glass, and they're curved. Very unique styling for its day. You know, for the most part back in those days, they used to shield the people in the back from the view of everybody. This, the Starlight Coupe, gave the ability for the people in the back seat, well, to see everything, to get as much light as the people in the front seat. And then the other thing they had was this trunk that came down and actually looked like the hood of a car. The running joke back in those days was people didn't know whether the car was coming towards them or going away from them. Can you imagine if you were driving down the road and you saw what looked like the hood of a car and the windshield of a car coming towards you? So where did this design come from? Well, that's kind of a complicated and interesting question, because Raymond Loewy, who was one of the great industrial designers of our time, his company had been tasked with coming up with the new styling for the post-war Studebaker. And indeed, Raymond Loewy did just that. But at the same time, there was a gentleman working for Raymond Loewy. You might have heard of him. His name is Virgil Exner, became one of the great automotive designers of the 50s and the 60s. Well, he was working with the folks at Studebaker and came up with his own design while he was working for Raymond Loewy. So Raymond Loewy, it turned out, had a bit of a rogue within his own team, somebody who was embedded at Studebaker. And this is the design that Virgil Exner came up with. So while it was supposed to be Raymond Loewy, it was actually Virgil Exner working for Raymond Loewy, which came up with this very interesting design. Now, I should point out that Virgil Exner was fired by Raymond Loewy for exactly what happened with this car, but it turned out okay. He had a pretty good career. The other thing that makes this design so interesting for me was in 1950 and 1951, they decided to completely restyle the front of the car. Now, when it first came out in 1947, 48, and 49, it had what most of us would consider a fairly traditional front end of the car in terms of the grille and the way it stretched across the front of the car. For 1950, they wanted to go in a completely different direction, and they came out with this bullet or spinner nose, depending upon what you want to call it. Now, Tucker had done something similar in 1948 with the single headlight mounted on the front of the car. Ford in 1949 had come out with a bullet that was kind of embedded in the grille down below. But when they came out with this design in 1950, they had gone even more boldly into that direction, not just set into the grille. Similar to the headlight on the Tucker, it was bold and out front, although unlike the Tucker, it didn't have any additional purposes other than simply making a statement on the front of the car. And it did exactly that. I mean, when you saw this car coming, how completely different it looked than any other car on the road. And you got to remember, there were only 51 Tuckers made in 1948. There were hundreds of thousands of these cars that were sold, so an awful lot of people saw this bullet coming at them as they were cruising down the road. Now, who designed this? Well, remember I mentioned that Virgil Exner had been working for Raymond Loewy. But as I also mentioned, he was let go by Raymond Loewy. A guy by the name of Bob Burke was part of the design team that worked on this and came out with this styling and this design. And I tell you what, when you see this coming, it is completely different than anything else you would see back in 1950. Yeah, Ford had a bullet, but nothing as bold as this one. Let's take a walk around and look at the styling on this 1951 Studebaker Champion Starlight Coupe. And of course, the first thing we have to notice is that rear window that I mentioned in the 4 separate pieces, and each one of them is curved. Notice there's a very gentle curve right here, a very strong curve right here, and then of course repeated on the other side, providing an awful lot of light going into the inside of the car, which I'm assuming is why they called it the Starlight Coupe. Had a very traditional pontoon fender. This is what Chevrolet was using back in the late 40s and early 50s, although Ford was kind of getting away from it, getting to more of the shoebox styling, but this is similar to what Chrysler was using as well in terms of having that style. In the pre-war era, of course, the fender would have been popping out, and that's kind of what they were going for, but they also accented it and make sure it looked like it was rolling forward. This is that trunk that, as I mentioned, looked like it was a hood. If you look at this from the back, at first glance, doesn't actually look like the car's coming towards you. And this thing right here, the license plate light, actually looks like a hood ornament almost. So it's really interesting in how they've taken the design on this and really made it look so unique, like it's actually coming at you from behind. I'm not sure that they really wanted that impression. They simply wanted it to be bold and daring in terms of its styling. As you go down, very sleek and modern, pretty standard in most ways. One interesting element is this right here. There's actually a separate cowl section right here that actually has two lines, one for the door, one that mates up to the front section. However, it's been molded in right here or perhaps up above. So for some reason, they decided they wanted to opt for that. I like the fact that it has this vent that pops out right here so you can get flow through ventilation into the car. Now going up front, I need to point out that there is a distinction between the 1950 and the 1951 Studebaker. If you look at the 1950 Studebaker, first off, the section around the bullet is chrome, and right beside it are two chrome elements that actually look like propellers. For whatever reason, in 1951, they decided to get away from that. First off, they decided to go with a painted section right here. Then they got rid of those two chrome propellers on either side, and it says Studebaker on one side and then Champion on the other. Maybe they realized the propellers were old school and it was time to be more jet-like. In fact, that is exactly what they've got mounted on the hood of this car, with a hood ornament that looks similar to what Chevrolet was doing back in those days, but obviously very aviation inspired. And then I also love the way they've mounted the bumper down below. Look at this element right here where they've hidden the mounts to it, and then right here there's a space that goes down below. Very interesting styling. By the way, another difference between the 1950 and the 1951 are these grille panels. In 1950 it's set back in a little bit further. 1950 they're kind of bigger and up front and, well, let's just say bolder in terms of their look. I absolutely like the looks of the 1951 even more than the 1950. One other element I wanted to point out is what they've done up here. In 1950 and 51, the other car companies, Chevrolet and Ford, actually had a two-piece windshield with a bar that would run down the center. Studebaker opted for a curved windshield. Something was gently sloping around. Imagine how much easier it was to see out of this car as a result.
This 1951 Studebaker Champion Starlight Coupe is fairly standard inside. I would say it's comfortable enough. You do feel like you're sitting a little bit low in this, but it could be that over time the springs have kind of given out just a little bit. But I do love the fact that when you look out the windshield in this, what you see is no bar coming down the center of the windshield. Just one expanse. And it's got a very gentle curve, and it doesn't warp at all in terms of from a vision perspective. It does have the classic wind wings right here, which is what most cars had back in those days for ventilation. But in addition to that, as I mentioned on the outside, you also had those vents. And this little thing right here is what you would pull to open those vents. This has a 3-speed manual transmission, but you also had an option for either an overdrive or an automatic transmission. The overdrive was going to cost you an extra $87, and this was the overdrive right down here, which would simply kind of give you an extra gear, give you a little better mileage and a little lower cruising RPM on the highway. If you wanted the automatic transmission, well, that was going to cost you $190. Now, the Champion was a step down from the Commander, and the Commander actually had a different looking dashboard than the Champion did. The Commander had 3 gauges going across the dashboard in front of you. The Champion, well, it just has a single panel that has a speedometer kind of curving across, along with the oil, the heat for the engine, the ammeter, and of course the gasoline gauge. By the way, as I understand it back in those days, Studebaker was one of the first car companies to offer a cup holder. It was a $12.50 option if you wanted to buy it. Now, to be honest with you, I've never actually seen one. I don't know what it looks like. So if someone knows where we can find a picture, I'd love to take a look at that and see what it looked like back in those days. I love this radio that kind of goes all across with these, once again, these bullets that have the same styling, of course, as the bullet on the front of the car. Plenty of room up front, and I would say plenty of room in the back seat as well. When I look back here, I think it's very comfortable. I really like these armrests on the side of either side. And these actually, as I understand it, pop open, and there's a little storage compartment right there. So that's very cool. So not only does the people in the back get plenty of light, but they also, I think, had a pretty comfortable ride back there, which I think is very, very cool, all things considered. And I should mention also that this was actually a fairly comfortable car from a driving perspective. They called it the Miracle Ride, and they had improved it for 1951 specifically. They had stronger front control arms. They also had softer rear springs in the back to give it a gentler ride. So the fact that you were driving along in this car, in this 1951 Studebaker, you actually got a slightly better ride than you would have gotten the year before in 1950. Once again, nothing too fancy, and as I often point out, in 1950, you had to lean kind of far forward if you were going to be changing anything. Whether you were turning on the lights, operating the emergency brake, or turning on the radio, you were definitely having to, as your hand was on the wheel, move forward quite a bit. But all things considered, it's still a very nice-looking, simple, plain design. And I tell you what, this one here at the Martin Auto Museum is really nicely restored. This is arguably one of the best Champions I think I've ever seen. Between the Commander and the Champion was really the entry level. The Commander got a bigger six-cylinder engine in the beginning and then eventually went to a V8. The Champion, this car right here, had the smaller of the six-cylinder engine. At this point, it was a 170 cubic inch inline six, a flathead. Of course, you can see the spark plug sitting on the top, sometimes referred to as an L-head engine. This engine actually came out in the 1930s for Studebaker. They used it all the way up in this form up until about 1960 when they came out with the engine that they called the Skybolt 6. I'm not sure that was the best name they ever could have called it. I think they were thinking Thunderbolt, Skybolt, something like that, as opposed to Stolbolt, which was a different concept from Chevrolet. And basically what they did was they took the foundation of this engine and created an overhead valve combination on top. So they were able to get a little horsepower, a little more modern version of that, getting away from the traditional L-head engine. Now, as I mentioned, the Commander, in addition to getting a bigger six-cylinder engine for a period of time, also got the V8 engine in 1950. It was a pretty expensive option in 1950. I think it cost like $348. But for 1951, they decided they really wanted to ramp up the sales of that. And so they did some cost-cutting measures around the car and with the engine, and they were able to get the cost, the extra added cost for the optional engine, from $348 all the way down to just $111. So if you were considering buying a Studebaker Champion, they were hoping that you were going to bump up to the Commander, and guess what? It worked. Sales for the Commander more than doubled from 1950 to 1951. An awful lot of people found that V8 engine and the little more horsepower you got out of it definitely more appealing. It also stretched out the front of the car, as I understand, just a little bit. But for this Champion, pretty basic, six-cylinder engine underneath, no shortage of space to work on it if that's exactly what you wanted to do while you were working around this Studebaker Champion back in 1951.
The post-war era for Studebaker was actually pretty good. I mean, in 1947, when they first came out with that car, they sold 150,000 of them. By 1950, when this bullet nose came out, they sold nearly 350,000 Studebakers that year. Now, for 1951, when this car came out, the numbers actually dropped a little bit, but there were some reasons. It was considered a shorter model year for 1951. Also, the Korean War had broken out, and getting supplies and some of the materials they wanted kind of complicated things. But to be honest with you, this was probably the high water mark in terms of where Studebaker was going to go, because in the next few years they started to run into money problems. Ford and Chevrolet were literally having price wars, slashing prices like crazy to sell cars, and smaller companies like Studebaker just weren't able to keep up with that. As a result, Studebaker did a merger with Packard, Hudson, and Nash ultimately, and it wasn't enough. In fact, as they went through the 50s, they began to lose more money. They were spending a lot of money building these cars. And by the 1960s, well, that bell was being run, despite the fact that they came out with a very cool Avante, which was a really interesting design by Raymond Loewy. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough to save the company, and by the mid-60s, Studebaker was gone. But in 1951, if you wanted more style than anybody else on the road, what you wanted was this bullet-nosed Studebaker Champion Starlight Coupe with that wraparound rear window. Everybody saw you coming, and they knew that you'd done something different than everybody else.